Hello, adventurer. It's good to see you. You have made it to the morning grind.
Welcome, welcome.
It's the live stream at the beginning of the Geekverse, where we talk about all types of topics in geekdom, gaming, and fantasy, with an emphasis on being constructive and creating the things that we want to exist in the world.
It's all on the grind, Sizemore. Can't be too fine, can't be too coarse.
That's exactly right. There are a lot of adventures to be had today. Dungeons to explore and monsters to slay, and who knows what a random encounter might send our way. That's why we have to prepare, so settle in now for the morning grind with your favorite beverage in hand.
Tea? Or maybe something a little stronger. I've got a few bottles of the old Wynyard left.
Whatever you want. Pull up a chair.
Dude.
If you're feeling fancy, how about a cappuccino? Or a frappuccino? Or how about an espresso?
Just tea, thank you.
Sounds good to me, Gandalf. Whatever you want. I'm just glad you're here.
Everyone is welcome. You can just watch if you want. You don't have to worship anything you don't want to worship.
Thank you, Mike. But be forewarned.
Sometimes we get really strange characters around here.
Wait, what's that you say? Why can't you come and be a part of the stream?
My wife would disown me.
Oh no, I bet she'll be fine with it. Come on in.
Am I scared for my safety? No.
What are we supposed to do?
Everybody do the secret handshake.
Secret cultist handshake.
Oh, now do wizards who love each other.
This, my friend, is a science.
I still don't have gills, but it's fine.
It's all on the grind, son. Can't be too fine, can't be too coarse.
Dude, this would be a sick place to bring the band.
Indeed it would be, Dave. It really would. I'm seeing more people coming in. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Oh, look, here's someone new.
Is this the cultist meetup?
Yes it is.
Come to hang out? Please accept me. I have nothing else.
Okay, we accept you. Everyone's welcome here.
Brought some snacks.
Well, that makes things even better.
You want some coffee? I don't drink coffee. You sure?
It's cultist coffee.
What makes it cultist coffee?
I'm a cultist and I'm drinking it.
Oh. Then I'll have some.
What exactly is going on here?
I'm seeing more people coming in. Welcome. It's so great to have you. Oh, and look, here comes another stranger.
Can we help you?
Yes, fellow cultists. I could really use some food.
Oh yeah? Welcome. We have donuts.
Oh, it's me. I'm glad I'm here. I'm sure you have a few questions for me, though.
What's your name? Who do you work for? What god do you worship?
Great questions, Rob.
I'm Steve King, and I worship Nyarlathotep.
No, not really. I'm just Heath, and I won't be worshiping anything this morning. But I will be your host. Welcome to the office. We're going to have a great time. I've got my coffee ready, because now it's time for the morning grind.
If you could become a fish, that would be amazing. Then I could command you with my mental fish powers.
Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Welcome to the office. Welcome to the morning grind. I'm Heath. I'll be your host this morning. Today, I want to talk about wilderness travel. That was a topic that we were on and trying to see how different games explore that. And the Angry GM, I remembered, had at least one article on wilderness travel, but then I thought he's got two. And, his particular writing style can be verbose. So it takes a little bit to, I know a lot of people, a lot of people enjoy it. A lot of people don't read it because it's difficult there's a lot of extra fluff in it. But we're going to try to figure out what he's got there. It's been a long time since I have gone over that material. But on the subject of thinking about wilderness travel, what were his ideas? Because I've noticed, I forget what topic that we went over previously with the Angry GM, but he has some useful elements of game design, I think. Let's go over here. Let me make sure my Oh yeah, getting there is half the fun, and also how to get wilderness right. So that's it. He's got both of those topics. We'll just take a look at one of them today, unless for some reason it goes very quickly. Then we can take a look at both of them. There's one other thing I want to talk about that was a follow up from yesterday's conversation on the strike. I'll bring that up as well. But let's see who we got here this morning. Good morning, Lynn. Good morning, Lynn. Good morning, Zero the Blade. Good morning, Brett. Good morning. Good morning, Robert. Robert says, "Morning, gang. Let's be productive. Let's do it." I'm looking forward to having a really productive weekend. I've been really working on the yard. My lawnmower was broken again for like 3 weeks, and the yard got completely out of control. So I've been working on that for the past 2 days. Time to get some stuff done here. Diggs, by the way, 7 or Diggs BTW 7 is here, coming in from Twitch. Welcome to see. Good to see you on Twitch. I'm glad somebody finds us over there sometime. All right. So good morning, everybody. Let's see. Oh, Brett says, I have a client who is a carpenter in LA who's part of the strike. Well, that's interesting. I don't know how that works. The carpenter is striking. So or supporting both of them. I don't know how that works. But okay, so I didn't know though. So on that subject, let's breathe and sip. Let's breathe and sip. I got witch's brew this morning. Right here. So let's breathe and sip. 2 deep breaths, complete inhales, complete exhales, and then let's take our sip. Here we go. And sip. So on the subject of the strike, much better. I didn't understand, like names would go by. And a lot of what I was seeing was just when Cameron is posting or different names of the WGA leadership and things like that. I really wasn't connecting. The names really didn't mean a whole lot to me because I'm not really deep in that world or anything like that. So, but Adam Conover, so that name kept coming by, and we mentioned him yesterday because of the new leadership elections that's going on. But then also, previously when we had talked about the strike, people had told me to go, and that name had come up as well. Go and look up Adam Conover. He has information on the other side about the strike, and I didn't get to do that because I was doing other things. But then I was like, okay, so let me look this up. I didn't realize, but then actually, I think I have seen him before. So I was looking at this. So this is one of the guys who is a part of the leadership of the WGA, the Writers Guild. And I've seen him, if you just look him up on YouTube, he has a Joe Rogan interview here where they were discussing the trans athletes. They've got Hollywood's toxic underbelly. So I think I have seen him, and he seems to be I watched his video here on AI because I'm researching I want to do more research on AI because I want to do a complete series on generative AI here, specifically talking about LLMs and generative and diffusion models. So I was interested on his take on AI because that's obviously a big part of the strike. But then I realized that he, for instance, is supported by a Patreon. Now he probably does other things too, but I was like, oh, he has a significant Patreon because people like his YouTube channel and his podcasts, and so he's Patreon supported. And I was contrasting that to what we were reading yesterday about Twitter about what a difficult time a lot of the writers are having because of the strike, because they're not able to work and things like that. And that was a pretty depressing kind of Twitter thread, which is not a random controlled sample of everybody or anything like that. But I know that, the longer this goes on, we're 4 or 5 months into this, that's having a financial impact on people and an emotional impact, and that isn't really easy. I can see how if this is your leadership, if you don't have that, but your leadership is, got like $7,000 a month on Patreon, or it doesn't exactly say. I just looked at the number of backers that he's got on Patreon, and then his, the average, perhaps what might be the average cost of a pledge on Patreon. And other writers don't have that. If you're working on television and you are now on strike and you cannot work, so my point is, if you're looking at that, if you're in that situation, but your leadership has income outside of working on TV and movies and things like that, he doesn't feel that same incentive to end it the way the people who are dependent on the income do. So I can completely understand then why there would be a cognitive, for at least that reason. There may be other reasons as well, but at least that reason for a disconnect between maybe more rank and file members of the Writers Guild and leadership. And I don't know all the other names. I didn't look up all the other names, but this name kept coming up, Adam Conover. And so I can see how you might think, well, you don't really have an incentive to end the strike because you have income from other directions and we don't. So I can see why he is a controversial figure in the leadership then. Video quality is low. Uh-oh. I don't see that I'm syncing anything. We'll see if it adjusts on its own here. At the moment, it's telling me the stream signal, well, it was a little low, not bad though. We'll see if well, now it's back up. So we'll see if it was a temporary thing. Brett says that he says that regarding he says that 160,000 people who are part of the union, the average income of 80% of the union averages $26K a year, which is insanely low. He's a carpenter for movie and TV show sets. I can completely believe that. The average income of 80% of the union is $26K. That's another reason, though, why it seems like the union is losing public support, because often the numbers that you see for writers and other members of the guild are very high. But that's not the average. That's not what typically people make. They'll look at like what the high end people make, or that's the same with a lot of industries. Like if you look up like the SAG-AFTRA or something like that, like, oh, the actors are on strike, and then somebody will say something about how much Scarlett Johansson makes, or how much Robert Downey Jr. Makes on a film or something. And then people will be like, yeah, how can you possibly go on strike when that's but that's not the typical amount of money for an actor or actress who is part of the SAG, the Screen Actors Guild. Same way with writing. And even if your particular day rates are high, if you only get to work a few days a year, then you could very easily end up at like $26,000 a year. Brett says, he says that behind the scenes, they expect the strike to last into January 2024. Wow. That's going to change everything. Brett says he also said it's not just a writer strike, but almost the whole industry. Hey, Jappards. Hey, yeah, I meant to message you. We went over your link yesterday. You may have seen that. Thank you for posting that link about the SAG-AFTRA and the video game industry yesterday. So we took a look at that yesterday. So, anyway, now we know. So that I just had not connected that name to someone. I just saw names going by. So there we go. Now we actually have that name, and I understand when people were asking me, go and look him up, who he is. And I was watching some of his stuff. So now we have that idea. Okay, so today I thought we would take a look at wilderness information, because our goal here, or our objective with taking a look at wilderness travel, was to figure out how we can integrate wilderness travel into a game, specifically something like a West Marches style game, which is session focused, that we're going to say that we got 3 hours to do a game, and that's going to be a game session. We got to be fixated, so the game has to be fixed on a session. Because we can't guarantee that we're going to have the same players for multiple sessions in a row, especially. So we can't spend a lot of time getting to a dungeon and then get 25% of the way through a dungeon and then continue next week, because in that particular style of game, you've got to get to a dungeon or whatever location it is that you're going to be exploring. You've got to get there. You've got to do whatever you're going to be doing at that location. And then you also have to get back home, and you have to do it within about a 3-hour window, plus or minus half an hour. And so one of the things that you've got to do is you've got different phases of the game. You've got a phase of the game where you are at the home base, which can probably be done away from the table or as your downtime when you're going shopping or whatever. Then you've got to travel to the destination. Then you've got to travel to the destination and then explore. And then a lot of times it seems like the travel back is skipped over, and you just get back. You don't have to role play the getting back. It seems like in general. But we said, well, how do you handle getting there? Well, the Angry GM might have some philosophy on that. That's why we were looking at the travel system inside the One Ring. So we did a analysis of the One Ring's journey system, and it gamified and gave structure to a journey, which I actually think was pretty good. We don't often see things like that in Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, but we did have that structure in the One Ring. One thing the One Ring didn't do was very well, or didn't because it didn't pay attention to it so much, was the amount of time that it took to get there. It kind of said after the fact, once you go from location to location, you can kind of take a look at how much time it took. Go backwards and look at, based on how many different rolls you had to make, how much time might that have taken. But time seems to be a critical element, because you want to be able to plan your supplies. And then also the One Ring didn't really seem to have a situation where you could get lost. Now you might, because of a roll that your guide made or something, your roll might indicate that it's taking you additional time to get there. And well, okay, so you lost a day, but it didn't seem like you could really just get lost. And maybe that's good, but maybe that could be bad. Okay, so December 15th. So this is, he says, this balloon ballooned out to be very large. The second half of this article, though, is basically a bare bones system for resolving wilderness travel in D&D and Pathfinder. That's why it seems way long. In retrospect, it should have been 2 separate articles, theory and implementation, and if not for the last minute rewrite, it would have been. But I already did the whole thing, so you get an extra long article. Okay. Let me see if I can increase this size right here and see if we can come up with what the critical part of this actually is. Let's see. When you think about it, it's really amazing how easy it is to travel across the world. For example, in January, I made an annual pilgrimage to the land of my birth, the best state in the best damn state in the best damned country and the best damned planet in the universe. Okay, New York, USA. Okay, on the other hand, I found myself using one of those aggregation sites to search through all the flights to take me home from my current residence in the Mid-East. Okay, so actually I misspoke. It's amazing how easy it is to plan to travel across the world. Getting the plane tickets, booking the train, reserving a car and a hotel, those are easy. Then you actually have to get to the airport, board get through the airport security, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's why I was saying we have to figure out what's the meat in here. Okay, so here's the problem, he says. The heroes of your story generally live in some type of city, town, or village, or at least they stay there. But the story itself takes place in a dungeon that isn't in the city or town or village. That's usually several miles away, which explains why people haven't cleaned it out before. That's especially true in a West Marches style game. And even if the story isn't in some dungeon miles from down, the heroes might have to get to some other village or town miles away. The point is, heroes spend a lot of time traveling between point A and point B through the wilderness. Well, that's part that part isn't the problem. The problem is that on one hand, traveling from point A to point B is inherently the least interesting part of the adventure, or at least it feels that way. And that's fair, sort of. We'll come back to that point. Let's just assume it is for the moment. Traveling is inherently the least interesting part of the adventure. It isn't the monster-filled dungeon with traps and riddles and treasure. It isn't the city-state under the thrall of the Witch King. It isn't even the Oracle's temple. It's just crossing a blank spot on the map with no dots. On the other hand, the whole idea of a fantasy world, especially one like D&D, is that civilization is constantly at war with untamed, monster-filled wilderness. People don't travel far because travel is dangerous, and part of the reason why no one has plundered the monster-filled ruins or challenged the Witch King's rule, and why so few people visit the Oracle, who has all the answers, is because the journey is simply beyond most people. As Professor Dumbledore once said, it's a dangerous business, Harry, going out your door. It comes down to something that snobbish elite game designer nerds called ludocognitive dissonance, which is what normal people educated by TV tropes called gameplay story segregation. From a story perspective, we want to travel to be exciting and wild and dangerous. From a gameplay perspective, travel just doesn't make for interesting gameplay. And that's why when Hagrid and Dumbledore and McGonagall led the hobbits south through the mountains toward the Clashing Rocks or whatever, we got to watch a montage occasionally broken up by character development scenes and something about crayfish from Dunlin flying overhead, spying for Voldemort. Whatever. Daniel says, I can't get lost. It sometimes just takes me much longer to get there. Well, that's also okay. That seems to be the one ring approach to it. It would take you longer to get there. But the issue, that's fine. I think the issue, if you're going to go with that, was that there was no like resource expenditure in the journey system. Like, so you didn't have to worry about, okay, we're gearing up here and we got 10 days of rations with us and 10 days of supplies. But then it ended up taking us 14 days to get there because maybe so you narratively say you got lost. Okay, we got 14 days to get there. It took us 14 days. What was the consequence of that? Because I do want there to be a consequence. An important part of this is there has to be risk and consequence and decisions. Important decisions that you're going to have to make along the travel phase that are going to materially impact what happens at the adventure location. And that could be a expenditure of probably in the expenditure of some type of resources. The amount of rations you've got to get there. In Dungeons and Dragons, it's very difficult to do that with, say, spells cast or even hit points because you're going to get those back. Like, you might think, well, gee, if you have a lot of combat encounters, if you end up getting lost and you end up having to fight some extra goblins and it takes you another week to get to your destination, you might be out of food and injured from the goblin fight and have less spells, used up magical resources. But in Dungeons and Dragons, you're never going to have that, which is because you can just rest and get back your spells and your hit points come back easily. So there has to be something else. There has to be something else. Because otherwise, why do it? And I've certainly felt that when playing at a Dungeons and Dragons table before. Oh, okay, we're traveling from here to there. Oh, we've hit a random encounter. This random encounter actually doesn't mean much. It can take a relatively long time to play out this random encounter while something shows up and fights us randomly. And it's also not really going to matter because we're going to be able to rest anyway, get back all of our spells and supplies, and then we're not going to be any worse for the wear by the time we actually get to the adventure location. And that seems to me to be a weak part of game design. Jafford says, I'm going to extend that. Can you place a dungeon off the beaten path with their own side stories, Bethesda style? Zero the Blade says, sounds like the famous saying, not the destination, but the journey you take is the story. Right, and sometimes you have to eat Sir Robin's minstrel. Right, exactly. So the two solutions, basically, the problem is this. As part of an adventure, travel is boring. What do? Well, there's two good solutions, and then there's the crappy solution everyone actually goes with. Let's talk about the two good solutions first, because the crappy solution will actually help us in a bit. Solution the first is just to skip the travel. Seriously, just narrate it. Wave your magical GM time turner and say, after several days of travel through the wilderness, you skip ahead to the exciting part of the adventure, but trust me, the journey was really harrowing and would have killed a peasant. It was that bad. Yes, I'm calling that a good solution. That solution is perfectly fine. I mean, you can skip the sarcasm if you want, and you can be a little bit more flavorful and say things like, you struggle through the harrowing woods of Harrowwood, struggling against the terrain and the thick, rank undergrowth, where the tangled, knotted canopy is so thick and blots out much of the light that it feels like you're actually journeying underground. But it's basically the same thing. Remember that scene in The Muppets, the one with John Statham that came out in 2011? I do not. The scene where they can push a button in the car to travel by map, and then we see a map with a red line plotting the course the Muppets took, and then in the end, they emerged from the Atlantic Ocean talking about what a great trip it was. Or remember the scene in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Temple of the Crusade of Doom, where they are traveling and Indy presses the button in the plane and or the blimp to time travel by map, or to travel by map, and then we see a map and a red line plotting the course Indy took until his plane gets shot down by Nazis, and he ended up riding a river raft filled with snakes down the side of Mount St. Helens and discovering the Cross of Coronado. Same thing. This is a good solution. It really, really is. Assume the travel happens off camera, narrate a line on the map, and then zoom back in when the players are at the interesting part. There is nothing wrong with it. It's a good solution. It fixes the problem, and it doesn't ruin the game. I know that sounds crazy, but everything I say sounds crazy when your brain is wrong. Okay. The second solution is just to make the travel interesting enough to be a fun part of the game. That is also a good solution. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for what is the implementation of this solution. Robert says, I'm thinking of adding a teleportation element. Current travel conditions, crappy. Now, let's talk about the third stupid solution that most GMs adopt. I know. You want to hear more about that other thing about making travel interesting. But it's important that we look at the crappy hybrid solution because it will help us come up with a good solution. The current crappy solution most GMs adopt is this. Knowing that travel is inherently boring, but also important from a world-building perspective, most GMs try to rush through it. They throw travel a bone, and there's a couple of ways they might do that. First, you have the well-intentioned GM who wants to make travel fun, so she tries using those random encounter tables. Every in-game day, she rolls a random encounter, and every few days, there's a random encounter. She has the party stumble over a random monster, announces the random monster is trying to kill the party, and then runs a combat. And that's it. At most, she provides one random monster encounter per day. And because of the way the system favors multiple encounters per day and very quick recovery, these encounters really aren't serious threats, which is actually what I was just talking about. But at least she's trying. She's doing what the book told her. She's rolling for random encounters and running them. Second, you have the GM who recognized that travel isn't fun, even with random encounters, but still knows that travel is important to world building and all of that crap. But she hates it, and she knows her players hate it. Rather than cut it out altogether and just let it happen off screen and let clever narration provide suspension of disbelief and give the illusion the world is dangerous while admitting that it isn't fun to worry about dangerous travel, she adopts the Genowian encounter solution. I don't know if that's something I'm supposed to know what it is or not. That is, whenever the party travels from point A to B, however far apart those points might be, they will have one and precisely one, ein und Genowian. Okay, encounter. That's how we ended up with that. So Robert was talking about teleportation. And Daniel says, cut out the middleman. Just get to where you need to go. Yeah, so ein is German, so it must be, yes. So it's a German phrase. Okay, so seriously, think about it. You may never have realized it, but you probably had GMs who adopted the genuine encounter solution. Seriously, Mr. Wizard explained it in the Order of the Stick comic number 145. That's how prevalent it is. The Order of the Stick made fun of it back when the comic was actually fun. Remember Fun? What the hell happened to Fun? I don't know that comic. Honestly, both solutions are sort of an evolution. The well-intentioned GM eventually gets bored with random encounters because I'm generally... excuse me. Generally, I have reasons to be against random encounters. I understand what they're there and what they're trying to do, but they're often failing. The random element allows the players to know, okay, there's going to be something, or not know what they're going to encounter on the way. When you're trying to gear up, when you're trying to prepare for your journey, you don't really, or you might have some idea about where you're going to and what kind of things you might face in there. You might not really, but then also, okay, when we're traveling there, we can't also perfectly gear up because we don't exactly know what's going to happen to us as we're going there. So that's that's a part of discouraging optimal play. And we talked about that too, that I want a system that discourages optimal play because especially when you're faced with time constraints, and as I often say, time is an underused element in RPGs, especially when if you're faced with time constraints in the real world, you often don't make optimal solutions or don't behave in an optimal way because there's no time to think about everything and puzzle it all out. You've got a lot more time when you're sitting down at an RPG table, even though the characters wouldn't have a lot of time to actually play optimally. So one of the ways that a random encounter should be having you not be able to play optimally, I think if it's doing its thing correctly, is by saying, well, there's a bunch of possible things that could happen to you, but you don't know what's going to happen to you, so you can't prepare in an optimal way. Zero the Blade says the Order of the Stick is a 3.5 campaign comic series that shows the ups and downs of a years-long campaign games. Thank you. Okay, so that we were saying that cuts down one random encounter just to prove travel is really dangerous, and everyone seems less happy. Or less unhappy. Less unhappy. Which is the same as happy. And if the poor GM could just take one more step, she'd turn travel into narrated montages and her game would be a lot more fun. So, okay, this idea actually of one encounter between where you were going and where you were trying to get, that's probably all you're going to have time for in a 3-hour session. Because you want to spend most of your time at your location doing whatever it is that's going to be at that location. If it's more West Marches, then it's probably going to be a lot of dungeon clearing and dungeon fighting and all of that. Probably. And so how much time do you really have to spend on travel? It's not going to be much, 15 to 30 minutes. Okay, and if God. And if the poor GM could just take one more step, she'd turn travel into a narrated montages and her game would be a lot more fun. A case for interesting travel. Now, I know I've supported the whole don't even bother with travel except as a line of narration thing a few times. And it might seem like I'm pushing that solution. And I am, sort of. The thing is, I support it as a better solution than either the well-intentioned random encounter roller or the genuine encounter solution. At least it solves the problem of cutting out the boring part. But as I mentioned, there is another solution, and here it is. Make travel interesting. That solution, however, presents two problems. First, it means you're spending game time on traveling between point A and point B. Second, it takes work. But those problems aren't as bad as they seem. We'll get back to them in a second. First, allow me to make a case for interesting travel. The thing is, the world is supposed to be dangerous. Traveling between sites is supposed to be daunting, and traveling beyond the confines of civilization into the untamed wilderness is part of makes adventuring an adventure. The reason people get so turned off to trying to make travel a part of the game is that they confuse the idea with execution. And that's a very common problem a lot of gamers have in their stupid gamer brains. Yes, I said it. I put forward this idea before, both on this website and on Twitter, and have been immediately attacked as being terrible ideas, which is really stupid because I don't have terrible ideas. I have great ideas. For example, I've been thinking through an interesting way RPGs might handle item crafting. I've said as much on Twitter, and half the responses I've gotten back have involved how terrible crafting is in Pathfinder and D&D 3.5 and how it obviously can't work. I'm also for crafting ideas. I know he did a lot of work on crafting ideas too. Anything D&D or Pathfinder has ever done, that's the execution of an idea. That's a specific execution. The idea is to have a system that allows players to craft tools and weapons and armor and magic items. And the idea isn't bad. In fact, it's good for a lot of reasons. But Pathfinder and D&D keep effing it up. And now people assume that the idea of crafting is bad because D&D and Pathfinder's specific execution was not good. Same here. I'm not arguing the rules of D&D don't really handle travel in an interesting or engaging way. In fact, a lot of the mechanics I'm going to point out in a minute that specifically exist for the purposes of making travel a part of the adventure, they are universally reviled rules that most GMs avoid. But that doesn't mean that travel as part of the adventure is a bad idea, just that D&D hasn't gotten it right. The idea of... So, I mean, that seems to be what the One Ring was trying to do. Let's go back and let's rethink a structure for trying to get from one location to another. And here's the other thing. Apart from the world-building reasons for interesting and dangerous travel, and apart from it being part of the spirit of the adventure, it also helps to fix other problems with the pace of the game. If travel is hard and daunting, then when the PCs are far from home, they are less likely to retreat to home whenever the going gets tough. That is also a great point. While exploring the dungeon, they won't retreat back to town. You can't go back to town. That is an important element of this. If it took you a week to get out there, and now you're at your dungeon doing your exploration, going home basically means calling it off. Either you're going home because we're victorious and you got the treasure, cleaned out the monsters, but you're not going to just go home to gear back up. I mean, that's basically a retreat, and it should have risk. The retreat, I guess that's a reason for the return journey also having some type of threat to it, because you can't fully expend everything at the dungeon. You've also got to get things back home, especially in games where XP is being given out for treasure values and such, the amount of gold coins that you actually bring back to a safe location. Just because you discovered in the dungeon, I thought that was interesting, just because you discovered it in the dungeon doesn't mean that you get the XP for it. You've got to get it back home. And if you used up too much of your resources at the dungeon, you might not be able to get it back home. And likewise, if things go really bad for you, you might realize we don't really have a choice to go back to town because because our resources are low and we can't take care of the travel. So if we got this injured PC or something like that, we might have to do come up with some other solution. They will retreat to their temporary encampment. And because that camp itself may not be 100% safe, they'll be inclined to get stuff done in as few days as possible. They won't want to be in the wilderness for too long. Instead of taking 20 days to clean out a dungeon, one encounter per day, and then a long sleep for the night, they will want to clean it out in 2 days. What that means, though, is that you have to start thinking of travel time as part of the adventure. That is, site-based adventures have 3 parts: there, adventure, and back again. And that means that a 2-session adventure might involve half a session of travel, then half a session of dungeon at the first session, and then half a session of dungeon followed by half a session of travel to the second session. I'm fine with that structure. I'm trying to compress it into one. And then there's going to be some GMs who look at that and then freak out. But hold on, don't freak out yet. Remember, the key isn't just to waste sessions on travel. The key is to make travel interesting enough to be part of the adventure. So hold your moaning until the end, okay? So the structure of a site-based adventure becomes 1. Party plans the trek and buys supplies. The party survives the trip. The party establishes a temporary base camp in the wilderness near the site. The party adventures to the site. The party breaks camp and journey back, and then get drunk in the tavern. Yes, okay, I would say that is what we're trying to do here. The structure can actually create an interesting feeling of progression in a campaign centered around a home base. See, at low levels, the party can't travel too far from their home. They can't carry enough supplies or reliably survive off the land. They are restricted to local problems. They gain the means they can invest in mounts, hirelings, carts, portable holes, bags of holding, and so on to remove those obstacles so they can survive longer across more hostile terrain. They go deeper into the wilderness and forge their way across more and more hostile terrain. Various options like teleportation, flight, and the ability to magically conjure food and water, and all of that other crap that actually becomes super valuable. Teleportation, for example, removes the entire trip home. Hell, even removes the need for a temporary camp. You just need to make the trip once to get a fix on a location. And I would argue that's exactly how it should be. In a standard campaign of exploration and adventure, that is exactly how you want the game to feel. The world opens up simply because the party can survive where others can't. And if you're running a wide open sandbox type exploration experience, you don't have to rely solely on using two powerful monsters to keep the PCs from traveling too far too soon, unlike something like Fallout. So that's like, if you've got a stable of PCs, if you've got a stable of different characters that you're going to be playing, one of the advantages of having the higher level characters, assuming you're doing this in an environment where you were having character levels, and it does seem like a West Marches style game should have character levels. Seems like that's part of its style. So your higher level characters should be able to journey further from home base. I wonder, okay, that sounds like something that needs to be implemented, because if you're pulling out your level 1 characters, you shouldn't be able to walk or travel all the way across the map. And you could, if you want to do that in the most artificial way, you could just limit the number of like hexes that you can travel in order to execute an adventure. Oh, well, this is interesting. That's the simplest way then would be to say, here's a table that shows you your character level, and maybe you do it by average level of the group. That way you can play with characters that are of different levels, which is a more old school kind of thing to do. Find out the average level of your party. Okay. Now, according to this table over here, this is the number of hexes. If you want to get more sophisticated, how many points of movement, points of overland journey movement your characters can execute in a specified time for one journey, and then have the map and show them where they can go. And if you want to go further than that, you've got to level up. If you want to do that in a less artificially constrained way, then what you do is you look at some other things the character gets beyond the raw level and use that to generate how far they can actually travel. Mark's Genre Mixer, welcome, says, if game time is an issue, 5 torches deep may have a solution. It has tables to roll on for the party gets lost, damage taken, etc. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but possible tool to try. Thank you for that recommendation. Where's my morning grind notes? We have looked at 5 torches deep in the past, but I don't think we looked at travel rules. That was back when we were just looking at gameplay implementations. So 5 torches deep has travel rules that we should look at. I'm going to make note over here on that. Thank you. So, I would argue this is exactly how the adventure should be. This is higher level characters can travel further. In a standard campaign of exploration and adventure, that is exactly how you want the game to feel. The world opens up because the party can survive where others can't. And if you're running a wide open sandbox type exploration experience, you don't have to rely solely on PCs using two powerful monsters to keep the PCs from traveling too far, unlike something else in Fallout. If you're going to be taming the wilderness, your initial characters should become foundational, assuming they don't die, foundational in the establishment of the world beyond the realm. The world beyond your along the frontier, the world into the frontier. It's the high level PC that can go out and create a stronghold of some type. I'm going to go, that's like the fighter saying, I'm going to become, in the old school terminology, lord. I'm going to become a baron out here of some kind. I don't know who you're under fealty to when you're out in the wilderness, but I'm going to go get my lord. I'm going to go become a lord. So I'm going to go carve out this area of wilderness and I'm going to build my castle. And that's going to be that. So probably then there's like a road constructed. You're going to construct a road between here and over there where that fighter now houses castle. Then a lower level character should be able to travel along the road. So now if you're restarting, you got people are coming in with low level characters. Well, you don't have to just go adventuring 4 hexes around your point where your frontier town that you're starting at. You don't have to adventure just within 4 hexes of that. Now you can also travel down the road and then go 4 hexes away from the Baron's castle. Something like that could work. All of that said, if that's not something you want, that's cool. I'm just going to encourage you to cut out even throwing travel a bone. Just admit that you don't want to travel to matter in your game, and then don't bother with random rolls or genuine encounters. Just narrate the trip, make it sound suitably epic, and then start the adventure at the door of the dungeon. It really is fine. But suppose you do like the idea of making travel a part of the adventure. You might still find the extra work daunting and the idea of losing table time to travel a bit irksome. But fear not. If I told you I would handle these criticisms, and now I will. Besides, because those are only imaginary problems. See, if travel is an interesting part of the adventure instead of a prologue and epilogue, you aren't wasting table time at all. Getting there becomes half of the fun. In other words, you aren't trading the fun part, adventure, for the crappy part, travel. You're making it all fun. A session is still a fun session filled with adventure. It's just some of the adventure is outdoors and on the road. And if you can wrap your head around that, you'll also recognize it isn't any more work. You still have to fill the same amount of table time with game. It's just that some of the time you're spending designing the dungeon will be spent designing the wilderness. Your dungeons might become a little smaller and less complicated, or they might take more sessions to explore, but the amount of work you put in per session will be the same. Unsucking travel. So let's talk about why travel sucks and how to unsuck it. Travel in D&D currently follows the Final Fantasy model, or if you prefer, the Pokemon model. You decide where you are going to start walking, and then wham, a random encounter shakes your screen and you have a fight. Then you keep walking, and then another encounter, and another. You use tents and healing items to keep yourself in fighting shape for the trip. And finally, when you get to the dungeon location, you use a tent, save your game, and plunge inside. Honestly, calling that the Pokemon model isn't really very accurate. See, in Pokemon, the random encounters serve some purpose. They allow you to encounter new Pokemon and add them to your digital Poke Prison. As at least the first few encounters in any new region do that. In Final Fantasy, they don't even do that. Sure that you gain XP and money, but you also gain XP and money from dungeons, and dungeons are more interesting. So the random overland encounters are just a bunch of boring, grindy BS between you and the fun. The problem is that nothing in that entire process involves any sort of interesting choices. And that's very important here too, because I said that's part of what I think should go on with travel, is that it needs to be some type of element of risk, and you need to have some element of choice. There needs to be at least one interesting and significant choice that the players have to make in order that will actually have a material impact on what happens at the dungeon. And that can be because like you use certain resources that you don't have available for the dungeon, for instance. Nor does it involve any type of exploration. Once you know where you're going, you take the shortest route and try to minimize the encounters along the way. Some games handle it better. Dragon Quest VIII, for instance, had all sorts of stuff hidden in the wilderness off the beaten path that you could hunt down. Occasionally, even interesting optional landmarks. You could stick to the road, which reduced the chances of a random encounter and got you where you were going fairly quickly, where there were roads. Or you could wander off the road, taking a longer path and tolerate a higher chance of random monsters, but you could find rare items, friendly monsters you could recruit, and even strange landmarks and optional sites. And it's these little choices that make all the difference. The key then is choice. For travel to be interesting, the party has to make interesting choices. I agree. And those choices can't be to decide which attack to use on the monsters. Likewise, travel has to involve a component of risk. Often in Final Fantasy style games, the overland encounters tend to quickly become trivial. You just grind them, clicking attack, attack, attack over and over. Hell, I played some of these games with a book in hand to read while attacking my way across the wilderness. The players need to face actual dangers, not just getting killed by monsters. They have to risk getting lost and running out of resources. I agree. And this is where things get really complicated. In order for there to be risk and choice, there have to be some conflicts in play. That is, the party must find themselves forced to choose between different desirable things or between different undesirable things. Which also, this has kind of come up here, but it's a good thing to point out as well. If there's exploration, if the PCs are, I'm going from here to here, what if the PCs see something interesting? They could decide to investigate it rather than going on to their other destination. Like, that would be an interesting choice. Well, we were setting out to go over here, but we ended up a little bit off of our way this way, and we saw that we found this other interesting ruin. So we decided we only have a certain amount of resources as far as food and rations go, that we're going to go over and investigate this other ruin instead because it seems pretty cool and we just found it. I guess you have to have that set up as far as the GM goes, but I think that's what he's talking about with wilderness design. Remember, we talk about conflict here. We're talking about goals in conflict, motivations in conflict, incentives in conflict, and risks in conflict. For example, imagine the choice between a long, safe path and a short, dangerous path. That creates a conflict. Do you risk the dangerous path to save time? What's more important, time or safety? This is the kind of decision that I think you should be making. Yes, if you're traveling to a dungeon with no time pressure, you might be willing to dawdle to make sure you arrive safe and healthy and be able to tackle the dungeon. If you're delivering medicine, you might not be able to afford the extra time. That's why time is an important element in RPGs that's underused. But you might risk having the medicine stolen by brigands. See? Conflict. In order to oh, look, he's about to talk about time. In order to understand how to create conflict in travel, we need to talk about the forces and motivations at play when the party travels from point A to point B, as well as the risks, rewards, and consequences. So let's look at them. Time. The first travel factor is time, how long it takes to get from point A to point B. Now, it might seem like time is only a factor when it's important, such as when there's a deadline or a pursuit of an evasion going on. But if you handle travel right, time is a factor all of the time. See, wilderness is dangerous. That's the first thing. The more time you spend in the wilderness, the more likely you are to get killed by monsters or blunder into dangerous hazards. This, by the way, is the pressure that random encounters are supposed to supply. We'll come back to that later. Yes, that's what the random encounters are supposed to be doing. I think that's why we have them. Because, hey, if you spend a lot of time walking around here, you're going to be rolling on this random encounter table, and that's going to chew up your resources. But in practice, for instance, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, that does not do that. That's what it's supposed to be doing, but it's not really doing it. But time also weighs in on the heroes in another way. See, humans and human-like creatures need food and water to survive. Surprise. And in the wilderness, there are no taverns or bakeries or fruit vendors. So in general, the more time the party spends in the wilderness, the more supplies they need. And it may not be possible to carry enough supplies for long trips or to find food and water wherever you go. So yeah, so people will say, well, I'll just forage. Well, that was a part of the One Ring RPG. You know, I'll just forage. But that should take time. That should take time. Why would you? First of all, you've got to have somebody who's experienced at that. There's a reason why I don't just go walk someplace for 3 days and go, well, I'll just hunt, because I don't really know anything about that. Especially when it comes to, well, okay, now even if I killed something, then how exactly do you cook and clean? It'd be much easier for me just to take food along with me. Certain specialist D&D characters would be experts in that. For instance, a ranger. You would think the rangers would be fine, but it still takes extra time. If we're going to we're out of food, we're going to rely on the ranger bringing in food and preparing it for us, and we're going to cook and clean. That's going to take in-game time. This is the factor that rations, encumbrance, and foraging and survival are supposed to drive. I agree completely. We'll come back to that too. In point of fact, thanks to being both the danger of random encounters and the need for supplies, time is the biggest factor driving choices in the wilderness. In general, all else being equal, the shortest trip possible is the best trip. It minimizes danger and the need for supplies. Any other time pressure simply adds to the weight of time. So what affects the time that it takes to travel? Well, first and foremost, there's the distance traveled. The further the distance, the longer the time. That's pretty straightforward, right? But some routes are more direct than others. Roads tend to take a circuitous route following the easiest terrain, and there are some barriers that most PCs can't handle. Rivers can be difficult to cross except at bridges, ferries, or fords unless the party wants to build a raft or craft a boat. High mountains can be all but insurmountable except following winding paths through them. Fortunately, as circuitous as they are, roads present ways around barriers, winding along cliffs, through passes, over bridges, and across fords. So the distance along the route is a big factor, but the terrain also plays an important role on how much time it takes to travel. That's why you would do something if you're doing some type of level-based distance, level-dependent distance traveled for a certain journey. It might be better to go journey movement points, because then you can modify for terrain rather than just a certain number of hexes. But the terrain also plays an important role in how much time it takes to travel. Roads, meadows, and cultivated lands are easy to traverse. Trackless plains and flat lands aren't too much worse. But forests and woodlands with any sort of undergrowth can slow travelers down. Hills and badlands force the party to take meandering routes to avoid too much climbing. Wetlands and marshes slow the party down by forcing them to wander around trying to avoid deep water, or by forcing them to wade through thick mud and standing water. Sandy deserts drag at travelers' feet almost as much as thick mud does, and mountains can be all but insurmountable. Indirectly, the party controls the travel time simply by choosing their route. They can follow roads or stick to easy-to-traverse terrain and choose to travel across more difficult terrain. Often there's a trade-off. The harder route is often shorter. The longer route is often easier in terms of terrain. Then you start to add, now I'm thinking actually a little bit about Mighty Empires. That's kind of crazy, because in Mighty Empires, you have to roll to get your army across a mountain. It might be possible. Like if there's a road that goes over a mountain, the road is going to be taking you along some path that you basically know can be traversed. Sure, there might have been some type of rock slide that is temporarily blocking a road, but you would know the road's you're going to be able to get over the mountain if you go over here to this road. But what if you got to go someplace where there isn't a road over the mountain, which is a lot? Well, can you get across it? And if you can, how long does it take? The smaller the party, the more likely it is that you would be able to find some way across. It's like if you've got one person, can one person climb or get across a mountain at almost any location, basically? If it's just one person, then the answer is probably yes, because one person is very nimble and can climb, and that one person might be able to find things and climb a mountain pass that others are not able to do so. But as soon as you try to say, I'm bringing 100 people and they've all got horses, their ability to cross that mountain is going to be much less. And you might not exactly even know how much time it's going to take. So that's why rolling and saying, well, we're gonna have to spend only 5 days getting across this or whatever it is. But you don't know when you're leaving home how much time it's going to actually take to get across the mountain. Dungeon Master says, this aspect of the game is very difficult for me to make more interesting. And what seems that is the case with a lot of people. And of course, that's what the angry GM is talking about here. How do we? So we need to systematize making it interesting. He says he's got some kind of solution here. So we'll, as we keep going, we're gonna have the solution. But like whether or not the One Ring system was perfect, I think the solution is ultimately going to be some type of systemized approach to travel that make sure that it gamifies all of these elements. Factoring in both terrain and distance, the choice can come down to a simple numbers game. If the long, easy route is 20 miles and the short, hard route is only 8 miles but cuts the party speed in half, the harder route is the answer. It's equivalent to 16 miles at a normal pace. And a numbers game is not a choice. It's a puzzle, a math problem. But before we launch into another factor that can shift the choice, let me mention something that's pretty specific to 5th edition D&D. It's actually a really great idea. In 5e, the party can choose their travel pace. That is, they can travel at a fast pace, a normal pace, or a slow pace. Thus, they can choose 3 different speeds. And there are some specific trade-offs. At fast pace, the party's perception is penalized. They are more likely to blunder into trouble before they see it coming, and they are unable to forage for food while they travel. At a slow pace, the party is able to travel stealthily to try to get the drop on or avoid any potential trouble. In addition, navigators receive a bonus at slow pace and penalty at fast pace. That's actually a really nice feature. I think, yes, this is a good point. Travel pace is probably important. That's actually a really nice feature, though I will talk about some tweaks at the end of this article. Being able to choose a pace and to dynamically adjust your pace while traveling adds some much-needed control to the travel experience. Danger. The second factor is danger, the chance of encountering a hazard or monster and having to deal with it. I noted above that spending time in the wilderness is dangerous, but the danger factor can vary. It's just that most GMs don't vary it nearly enough, and when they do, they don't let players know about it. If you're going like one encounter for travel, then the encounter needs to be at the most dangerous location. So if you're plotting the distance and you only have time to play out one encounter at the table, it needs to be the most dangerous thing that can happen to you. Because that, first of all, that's showing you that lesser adventurers, if you're lower levels adventurers or whatever, would not be able to make this journey. Because and it also is telling you that if there's going to be something that's really going to stop you from making this journey, this would be the hardest one. I'm getting ideas here. Okay, danger factor. Civilized regions. I got flies in here, and it is really annoying. I have to figure out where they came from. Civilized regions are the safest. There are regions around town and villages and cities and farms along the roads, assuming the roads are even occasionally patrolled by the local authorities, and they usually are in civilized reaches. Contrast that with forests, flatlands, hills, and wetlands. Those areas tend to be the most dangerous because they all offer ample resources for creatures, intelligent and unintelligent, to live off of. Barren and treacherous regions tend to actually be a little safer because it's harder for living things to survive there to begin with. But that, again, is just a function of the terrain. And there's another factor to consider. Lots of creatures claim territory. Most intelligent, sentient creatures claim lands for themselves, from savage orcs and wily goblins to xenophobic wood elves. And traveling through their terrain can increase the danger. Likewise, the effects of the fantasy world can change the danger of a location. A forest under the magical protection of the Fae is less dangerous because most of the creatures there are peaceful. A tangled and gnarled ancient forest filled with vengeful tree sprites who despise humanity is quite dangerous. Players can control the danger of their route, but only if they know about the danger. And honestly, they should know about many of the dangers. Partly because it empowers them to make informed choices, but partly because people would know the dangers of traveling. The locals tell the party about how Goblin Wood is filled with goblins and their spider pets, and how no one goes in, comes out alive, except for that one guy who came out with a mess of spider eggs in his belly, and he keeled over in his soup one night, and spiders came spilling out of his mouth, and I mean it because my second cousin swears she saw it happen. The haunted hills filled with ancient barbarian tombs are probably pretty lousy with undead. Navigation. The third factor that drives choices in travel is navigation. See, without magical means, navigating is actually a lot harder than people realize. Suppose, for example, you set out traveling north on foot. You have a really good sense of direction and you're pretty close to true north. So let's say after traveling 10 feet to what you think is true north, you're actually just one itty-bitty little foot off. After one day, assuming you travel 24 miles, you'll be 3 miles left of your destination. 3 days on foot and you're 8 miles off your target. And if that target isn't big and visible, 8 miles is a lot of distance to be off by. Once you can't see where you're going, any distance off is lost. That's kind of a nasty stomachache. Daniel says that's the kind of stomachache I can get behind. At least you got a good reason for it. The thing is, most wilderness navigation is done by landmarks until you can see your destination. Travel north until you hit the river. Travel upriver until you come to the old crumbly tower. Follow the remains of the old road from there until you find the dungeon. Climb a tree or a hill so that you can spot it. If you're following a road or another terrain feature, navigation is a non-issue. After that you're relying on landmarks and direction sense, and you need a good navigator. Fortunately, most parties take along someone who is pretty skilled at navigation, either the party ranger or hired guide, but that person still runs the risk of getting lost. Navigation relies heavily on line of sight. The further you can see, the easier it is to orient yourself based on distant landmarks and determine your direction based on the sun, moon, and stars. But there's another side to that. There's nothing to see. If there's nothing to see except the sky, no distant landmarks, it's pretty hopeless. Because then you end up in that if you're even 1 foot off in 10 feet, you're going to miss your mark by miles problem. The end result is this. In open terrain where distant landmarks are visible, navigating is easiest. In terrain with bad lines of sight, like forests, marshes, and very varied terrain like rugged hills, navigation is more difficult. And when all you can see is the horizon, like out on an open sea or in the middle of a tundra or desert, navigation is extremely difficult. But what does navigation actually mean? This is the tricky bit. Navigation is only partly about finding your destination, assuming you have very good directions or very accurate map. And the second thing is extremely unlikely. Navigation helps you follow the directions and hopefully arrive near enough to your goal to spot it from a distance. But some goals are easier to miss than others. For example, if you're traveling to a town on the river, all you have to do is hit the river and then follow it. A river is a hard thing to miss, even if you're traveling vaguely in the right direction. In the end, it's the quality of the directions and the landmark that will determine whether or not you have a place, whether you find your place or not during navigation, though navigation does play a role. If you're supposed to travel west until you find a particular lake and you're miles off of the target, you might not be able to spot the lake and find yourself lost in the wilderness. So some kind of modification of the role based on what you were trying to target. That's really interesting. Zero the Blade says, is that why flying races are banned? Flying, that's interesting. Because flying would change things. If there are flying PCs, that definitely changes things. Or having a flying mount. Well, now if you talk about that, like getting a mount, okay, that would change up your travel speed, but you got to buy the mount. That's kind of like the World of Warcraft thing. It should be a big deal when it is a big deal, or at least it was years ago when I played World of Warcraft. Getting your mount, because all of a sudden you could travel faster and you actually had more control over the landscape. And your travel, because you could travel faster, you could travel further in less time, which is a major level up and as far as your capabilities go over those who don't have that. And it's even more so once you can fly. Getting that flying mount is a big deal. So PCs with flying mounts, they have the ability to explore a lot of terrain. Like now, if we can fly, if we're all on flying mounts, then navigation perhaps becomes less of an issue because you can see. And then also you're able to travel a lot further in less time. And so now you're able to go out there and reach out and explore that long lost dungeon or tomb that's way out there. And other people can't. So what navigation really does for you is tell you where you are and how to get back where you came from. And when you get lost, it isn't just about being able to find where you are going. It's about not being able to find your way back either. So what does getting lost mean? Well, what happens? Well, in general, getting lost means the party has been traveling in the wrong direction for some period of time. And depending on the nature of their directions, they might not be able to hit their goal. Again, if they're going for a river, that's hard to miss as long as they start moving in the right direction again. But a particular tower in a hilly badland or a small lake in rolling hills, the party could end up wandering for ages. But getting lost also means the party can't find their way back. Simply put, they have to guess at the way back. They have to try to retrace their steps. A good survivalist can follow the party's trail behind them for a little while, and that might be all it takes to get them back on track. But it's at that point that even an inaccurate map can help. If there's a road south of the forest that you're lost in, well, all you have to do is head back south and you'll hit the road somewhere along it. And since roads lead someplace, you'll find civilization eventually. Resources. The fourth factor that drives travel is the availability of resources. In wilderness travel terrain, resources generally represent food and water, the staples for survival. Lush wilderness, including meadows, forests, flatlands, and hills, provide a bounty for travelers. Everything from berries, nuts, fruit, and root to small games like rabbits and game birds. Realistically speaking, in such terrain, it's conceivable that a party can forage enough water to keep their skins and bellies full and enough food to survive on a day-to-day basis. But this is by no means assured. Barren wilderness can be a bit crueler. Rough hills, badlands, and tundras can make foraging much harder. And obviously, deserts and wastelands yield almost nothing. But there are other factors to consider as well. Resources are a bit more complicated. First of all, while civilized lands tend to actually yield less game as animals tend to avoid populated areas and mere acts of building roads can disrupt and divert local game trails, most traveled roads provide other resources for travelers. Roadside inns and farming homestead can provide food, water, and shelter in return for some coin. That's a resource right there, too. That's interesting. Money as a resource for travel. That might seem obvious now that it's been said. But if you are traveling along the road, you got low-level PCs and they're traveling along the road, they can do so without much threat. Because generally, at about the end of every day, there might be a small village or whatever, and an inn that accommodates travelers. So you don't have to worry, as long as you stay along the road, you're not going to get lost. You can travel further, but it's going to cost you coin. So it's not necessarily a toll road. It's just that, hey, you could sleep outside in a tent or whatever, but you don't have to worry about food, because every day of travel, pay X amount of coins, and then don't worry, you're taken care of as far as supplies, because this is a civilized region and there's a road going there. However, we'll talk about how to implement that at the end of this article. However, the fantasy element can also affect the resources available in terrain. See, the savage goblin forest is still effectively a civilized region. It's just civilized by evil goblins, and they and their spider friends might have suppressed the game and driven a lot of other creatures out of the forest. Orcs might have overhunted their barrens to the point where the game is scarce. Animals might avoid the haunted barrows because they're smart enough to avoid areas that have haunted right in their name. And the water in a region might also be spoiled. A fey forest might be rich and abundant, offering up ample fruit and root and berries for hungry travelers. Obviously, all this is supplemental to what the parties can carry themselves. The D&D 5e DMG, for example, indicates that a person needs to be about 1 pound of food and 1 gallon of water every day. Given that a water skin weighs 5 pounds, when it's full, it probably holds about half a gallon. A gallon of water is almost 9 pounds. The smart traveler carries 2 full skins and refills them whenever they can in the wild. So they're always carrying 10 pounds of water. That means for every day of travel, a PC should have to carry a pound of food. That's something encumbrance rules should use to create a trade-off between carrying extra food and relying on the bounty of land. That's what I see. I've said this quite a bit during the morning grind on different episodes. We've been talking about RPGs, that encumbrance should be playing an important role in the game. Now, we've talked about the disadvantage of tracking things pound by pound and ounce by ounce and picking this up. That's why I'm a fan of slot-based systems. And if it's taking up a slot, then it needs to be something that is significant. But this is something that, you should be using encumbrance rules, because it's actually giving having a material impact on the game, and it should be driving important choices of the PCs. That's what it's there to do. Encumbrance often sucks because you're having to add up, and if you're trying to add up every single ounce or whatever of everything that you're carrying, and then what's the result of adding all of that up anyway? Well, the result is you get to move slower, right? It's a penalty. You do all this work to figure out whether or not you have a penalty, right? And so that often sucks, and that's another reason why a lot of people often don't use it. But it should be driving important choices. This is something encumbrance rules should use to create a trade-off between carrying extra food and relying on the bounty of the land. We'll come back to that too, because D&D 5e especially messes that up. Discoveries. The final factor is a very interesting factor. This is the reason that I brought up Dragon Quest VIII above, and it's the one you might be familiar with if you played any of the sprawling, choking sandbox games by Bethesda like Skyrim or Fallout. This is the pull you off the road by your own curiosity factor of being able to spot interesting things that you want to check out. See, the world fantasy world of D&D is an old world, and many empires have risen and fallen on the sprawling surface. And that means there's always some random little half-collapsed tower or old gatehouse or ancient foundation or hinge or mausoleum or something waiting just over the next rise. And it's also a world of magic, which means there's always some stand of enchanted trees with purple leaves or a magical waterfall coming out of a portal in thin air or something to be found as well. The thing that never happens along the road, and a thing that should happen, is the party should spot something weird in the distance and debate checking it out. I'm not talking about discovering entire goddamn dungeons, but that's certainly possible too. I'm talking about spotting the ruined foundation of some old castle that has a small treasure in it, or a nasty monster, or both, or a plaque with a weird point of interest above the world, or a shrine whose offering bowl is still intact and has a couple of dozen ancient coins in it. There should be curiosities to pull the party off the road. There should be something enticing the players to ignore all the other factors and waste time in the wilderness. how to actually handle travel. How much, like, we might have to actually come back. Okay, I tell you what, we're gonna have to make this a two-part discussion. Okay, there's a lot here. He did say this was a whole lot of stuff here. So I guess that, yes, there's a whole lot of stuff here. So that was his theory behind travel. And I have to agree, I agree with a lot of it. So next we've got how to actually handle travel. And then we've got this other article that came later that says getting there is half, no, that's the one we're looking at right now. How to get wilderness right. Oh, it's another long article. So, but I think it's worth paying attention to. So we've looked at theory on this, and we'll be talking about the practical of this. We'll probably look at it tomorrow. Dungeon Master says the Dark Sun setting in 2E had some pretty savage traveling rules. We died more outside the cities than we did in dungeons. I remember we went through a lot of Dark Sun on this channel, and I do recall they were talking about the amount of water you could carry and. Yeah, the danger of traveling. I remember that being an important element of this. All right, so we will continue with this later. I think the overland travel and wilderness travel is an important subject. I've got 5 Torches Deep on here to look at. If there are other things that we should be looking at, let me know on this subject. It's possible that I also want to take a look at something like Gloomhaven. I mean, you've got travel in Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven's interesting because and I wonder how they're doing in Frosthaven. I got Frosthaven sitting over here, but I've never gotten to play. You're primarily going to a dungeon in Gloomhaven and Frosthaven, but you do have to travel to that location. And there's some element to something can happen to you along the way. So that's much more on the board game side, but we will see. All right. I am out of here. There's a lot of work to be done this weekend. I hope everybody has a great weekend. I hope that it is productive. I hope that it's fun. Please be creative, be constructive, and grind on. Later.